You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristen Dilley.
My name is Kristen Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristen Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined again by author Kate Miles, here to talk to us about her multiple award-winning book, Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. Kate, thank you for joining us again.
I can't believe you want to have me back, but I'm so grateful.
Now that you're going into paperback, which is a really big deal after the success of the hardcover book, this is a great time to have a follow-up conversation and find out all the good things that have been generated by your writing and publication of Trailed.
So start by bragging a little bit. Tell us about all the awards you've won, because you've won a lot and it's really impressive. So do the brag thing, and it doesn't even have to be a humble brag.
I've just been so grateful for the reception of this book. And I'm particularly grateful by how many people have been impacted on either a primary or secondary basis by this particular crime who have reached out. So for me, that's definitely more important than any possible award. But the book has done quite well, and we're really excited. The New York Times named one of the best true crime books of the year. That was great. The audiobook, which is really ably and expertly narrated by Gabra Zuckman, won several awards. We just won the main literary award for 2023. The book was a finalist for the Edgar Award. We just now learned that the book has just been named a finalist for the Virginia Book Award Reader's Choice. So That's a quick overview. Really exciting all around.
That is so fantastic. Oh my gosh. That's amazing. Congratulations on all of that.
It's just really great to know that this story resonates with people. You all know that when you're in the trenches and thinking so much about a particular crime or a particular issue, it gets all consuming for you. But sometimes it's hard to know whether or not it's going to be all consuming for people who read and listen to true crime as well.
But reading the reviews, Kate, people really talk about how much they were drawn into Julie and Lollie's story by reading Trailed, and how compelling they thought it was. And yes, there's a very sad component to this unsolved murder of these two beautiful young women, but it's a story that just pulls you in.
Well, and thank you for saying that. The most important thing for me all along has really been to foreground the stories of Lollie and Julie, primarily, obviously, as living, breathing humans who were really just exemplary leaders in their fields, and also in love, and telling that love story was really important to me. And then, of course, honoring them as victims as well as living people as well, and making sure people understand just what was taken away, not only from friends and family, but I think also the larger public when we lost these two individuals.
I do want to make sure that we talk a little bit more about your recent Library of Virginia speech that you did, but I really like the fact that you started out with pictures of Lollie and Julie, and you grounded everything in your presentation that way, with the fact that we are concerned primarily about these two women. And I like that. I appreciated it, and I could tell the audience did too.
With the book going into paperback, what changes, if any, were made to the book between the version that we have several copies on our bookshelves and the new version that is out in paperback now? What got changed, if anything?
In general, paperbacks are not changed. When we find a few typographical errors or things like that, those sorts of things might get changed. But really, the book reads pretty much exactly as it was written.
Bill and I were lucky enough to get advanced reader copies, but the one thing I know the paperback has in it that our ARCs did not is there are a lot of wonderful photographs and maps in there. Can you tell us a little bit about, how did you come into possession of those, and why was it so important to include those in the book?
Sure. I have worked with a really wonderful cartographer on all of my books. Her name's Margot Carpenter, and her company is called Hartdale Maps. And she does a really brilliant job of interpreting not just data, but also stories in order to tell something. And she and I worked together to create a series of maps for the book. And she did a really great job, too, of quietly evoking the style of the National Park Service maps and guidebooks and things like that. But it was really important for me, for readers to, first of all, understand in a general way place, and starting on a kind of macro level with Shenandoah Park as a whole. It's a really peculiar national park in some ways, in the way, especially in the fact that it's this long kind of winding park with one major road through it, and then basically tumbles down both sides of a mountain. And so the idea of backcountry means something very different in that park than it does in, say, Zion or Bryce or something like that. And so I wanted readers to understand both that and the proximity to population centers, to parking lots, to major roads and things like that, which I think is ultimately relevant when we think about who might have done this and how and why. I also really wanted folks to get a sense of the murder scene and how it relates to the area around Skyland Lodge. That was also really important to me. And then equally, if not more importantly, was making sure that we could put the context of these two murders within a larger context of a group of women, mostly young women, most of whom had some real, I think, physical similarities to Lollie and Julie, who were killed over the course of a year and a half in a fairly small circumference in what is largely rural Virginia. And I think when you see that on paper, the idea that this was an isolated incident becomes harder to accept.
How do you go about getting permission to use photographs, Kate? I know that you've got a lot of amazing photographs, many of which were never published before. How do you go about getting permissions?
That's a great question. Some of the photographs were published by the FBI. They were given to the FBI by the families. And so the FBI used them in press releases and posters and things like that. So they have permission to grant the media permission, and some of the photographs came from there. But Lollie and Julie's friends and family were the ones who supplied some of my very favorite photos of them. And obviously, Lollie and Julie can't consent to the photos, and it would be ideal if they could. But the friends giving them to me offered their consent. And I think that, you know, what I really love about them is I think it really just gets at their personalities and their love of life and their humanity. And again, I think it's just really important that people know that and really understand who these people were.
Some of the photographs were actually taken by the two women themselves. How did you end up with those photographs? They're from one of their cameras, correct?
So Lollie was a very avid photographer, and she had brought her camera on the trip. So that became really important, I think, for the investigation initially, because although the timestamp was way off on her camera, it would say something like January 1st, 1900 or something like, we can't know the exact days, but we can know the chronology of some of the places where they were in the park. That, coupled with their journals, coupled with their backcountry permits, allows us to recreate their time in the park in really good detail. There was also a young couple at the time who were vacationing in the park, and they had run into Lollie and Julie and just struck up a conversation, and they all took photos of each other. That became relevant as well, too, in terms of understanding where Lollie and Julie were and making identifications and things. And the woman who had been the wife of that couple, they're now divorced, she had sent those photos to me as well, too. So it's nice, I think, to be able to do this triangulation so that we can say for relative certain, we know they were at X place or Y place, and at least be able to approximate when.
You brought up the FBI already, so I guess let's go ahead and dive into talking about their response. And really not just the FBI, though. Let's talk about the response from law enforcement, National Park Service as well. What has their response been in relation to the book?
It has been hugely varied. Recently, an attorney for the Department of Justice recently reached out to me and told me he had read the book. And he asked me if I would be willing to come talk to the DOJ to ensure that this kind of investigation and these kind of foibles don't happen again. That, to me, was a huge endorsement of the research in the book. I think especially where the ideas of confirmation bias come in and some of the interview and interrogation techniques that I outline, which I think are morally questionable at best. So that was really great. I've heard secondhand from the family of some of the other surviving victims in Virginia that those law enforcement officials have been reading the book and using the book to re-examine some of those cases. They haven't reached out to me, which I find peculiar, but at least they're reading it. So that's something. Yeah. And then I also have heard secondhand that the publication of the book prompted the FBI to re-examine the case and to re-examine some of the Park Service law enforcement rangers who were involved in the case. And I've heard, again, secondhand, that they even went so far as to try to obtain some DNA swabs from some of the rangers. They are understandably not pleased. The reaction from at least one of them in particular has been very loud, I think. And so that's obviously not my preferred reaction, but I think it's good that this information is hitting a nerve. And I think maybe the more nerves it hits, the more likely it will be that the story is propelled forward and that the investigation is propelled forward.
As the brother of a murder victim whose sister's case is sometimes linked with the murder of Lollie and Julie, I will just say this should have been done years ago. And the fact that the FBI and the National Park Service and other law enforcement agencies are circling back around and collecting DNA samples from investigators and first responders now, more than 26 years after their murders in the Shenandoah, is shocking. This should have been done decades ago. And it shouldn't take all of the work and the research that you've done to produce Trailed to get the FBI and the National Park Service to do something that they should have done 20-something years ago.
And I can't imagine how frustrating it is to be the family member of a victim and know that so much hasn't been done. It's, for me as a journalist, it's frustrating, and I don't have that personal connection. And that's one of the things that I like to try to highlight when I'm talking about this book is the number of cold cases out in the country, the number of people like you who deserve answers and deserve a thorough investigation and have never had it, the number of rape kits and DNA samples that we've never tested, the number of DNA that we've never loaded to CODIS. This is a national endemic problem, and it's a crisis, I think. It's a crisis of justice that we really need to resolve.
I'm not hinting, by the way, that any of these people are directly involved or that someone in law enforcement is a murderer. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is you would think, I understand that this stuff didn't happen back in 1986 when my sister Kathy and her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski were murdered. DNA hadn't come out of the lab. But by the time we get to 1996, when Lollie and Julie are murdered, DNA has made its way out of the lab, thankfully. And just for elimination purposes, you would think that everyone involved in responding to these murders and investigating these murders would have submitted their DNA. Heck, I submitted my DNA at the FBI's request about 5 or 6 years ago. Again, because my DNA could have been in my sister's car. And why is it I have no problem whatsoever? They came to my office. They also met with my brother Richard in Washington, D.C., me in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time, and my younger brother in New York. And we said, sure, come on down. And I sat with the FBI agents because I wanted to have a conversation with them to ask them if they knew why they were collecting the DNA, which interestingly they did not. But they were very curious people, and I explained a short version of why they were there. And I have no problem with that. And I don't think anyone in law enforcement or any legitimate person would have any difficulty whatsoever turning over their DNA so that they can be eliminated, and that would allow their brothers and sisters in law enforcement to focus on potential suspects. I will challenge people listening to this podcast today, to my friends in law enforcement. I can't believe any of you are pushing back on giving your DNA. It should come with the territory. So cough it up. We all did it except for a handful of people that somehow are so righteous they can't stand the idea that their DNA would be looked at. No one's calling them a murderer. They're saying, let's narrow the focus to where it needs to be.
I know you've had firsthand experience and tremendous frustrations as well getting evidence from the scene tested as well. Right now, one of the things that I'm really fixated on is a bottle of Gatorade and a Walmart bag that were at the scene of the crime. They don't belong to Lollie and Julie. And Julie had a liquid in her stomach, which matches the Gatorade. They didn't buy it. Spoiler alert, we know that known serial killer Marc Evonitz regularly shopped at Walmart and also preferred to, and this is really just sadistic and terrible, but really preferred to keep his victims well hydrated. And he would regularly give them energy drinks while he was molesting them and abusing them and assaulting them. And so again, there are fingerprints on that Gatorade bottle. We know it doesn't belong to Lollie and Julie. We know we have fingerprints from the scene. Why would we not test that? There's an oily palm print on Julie's sleeping pad. Why would we not test that? Why would we not test the hair that was in Kathy Thomas's hand? It boggles the mind.
It truly does. We're no stranger to getting tips with relation to our case. Have people reached out to you with tips that they want you to follow up on or that they think law enforcement should follow up on?
Oh my, so many tips. And I would say all of them from very well-meaning people.
Yeah.
And I would say, if I can say it politely and decorously, I would say they run the gamut of plausibility. But I think anybody who takes the time to reach out, that's meaningful to me that somebody took the time to find me to tell me that as well. And certainly I keep track of all of them. Your listeners probably know that, again, sometimes Shenandoah and the first Colonial Parkway set of murders are linked. And so whenever I get anything that seems like it might be at all relevant to the case of Kathy and Becky, I like to forward that to Bill. And so he also has had a long suffering experience with some of these and is always a really good sport about receiving them as well, too. But you never know. I think if anything, what we're learning from podcasts and streaming shows, listservs and discussion boards is that citizen investigators move cases along all the time. So I think it's beholden upon us to take all of them seriously.
Yeah, over the years, both Kristen and I have fed a number of tips into the FBI. And again, we can't necessarily evaluate what's a good tip and what's not a good tip. Sometimes we talk about, does this person seem completely screwed down to the deck or not? But even then, just because someone's a little out there, or maybe even a lot out there, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be listened to because they may actually have something to say. And our attitude is we're going to turn those over to law enforcement because the FBI agents and Virginia State Police agents who are working our case, they know a lot more about this case than we know. Something might be said in a tip that would mean something to those investigators.
Yeah, and I think anything that moves these cases along, and also I think anything that might link these cases to other cases as well, too, I think that's really important. I was really appalled that when I was talking to Sadie Showalter, who's the surviving mother of Alicia Showalter Reynolds, who was killed about 6 weeks before Lollie and Julie, she didn't know that gloves had been found at the scene of where Alicia's car had been pulled over. She didn't know that cigarette butts had been found there as well. There's a very similar pair of gloves found at Lollie and Julie's scene. There's very similar, I don't know the brand because they're just butts, but cigarette butts as well too. What does it take then to cross-test those? Like, can we exclude even the DNA from those and the DNA from Lollie and Julie's? Anything I think that moves these cases along, not to some conclusion I want or choose, but to any kind of resolution, whatever that looks like, seems really important to me.
Have you received any new information or tips about Evonitz in particular?
The most, I think, significant work that's happening on the Evonitz front is actually being spearheaded by Deirdre Enright, at the University of Virginia. And she and her students have really been combing through a lot of the evidence that was preserved from Evonitz's residence. And so she's been working very actively to link him to other crimes as well, too. And I've been trying to assist on that in any way that I can. Again, I think that's super important as well, too. When he was in the high-speed police chase that would eventually lead to him taking his own life, he very famously said to his sister when she said, "How many times have you done this?" And he said, "More times than I remember." And in the book, I outline just a few of the leads we have about ways in which he was predating on other women, some of whom are still alive as well, too. And so for me, it's very clear that I think that we don't know the breadth of Evonitz's crimes, but I find it almost entirely unbelievable that he killed only 3 people. And I think anything that we can do to further close cases that he may have been involved in is really important as well.
For the benefit of someone who's buying the book today and hasn't read it yet, can you recap Evonitz's history in terms of what we know, who his specific victims are? I know we have suspicions beyond the core group, but can you talk a little bit about his criminal history as we understand it?
Sure. And I'll try to do it chronologically in terms of how we learned things. So he abducted a young woman named Kara Robinson, who was 16 at the time, and brought her back to his house where he really brutally abused her in myriad sexual ways. Incidentally, that's part of how we know about the Gatorade, is that he would try to keep Kara hydrated with the Gatorade. He had her handcuffed and shackled to his bed. When he had fallen asleep for the night, she managed to extricate herself and get help. Her story alone is utterly fascinating and worth telling in more time than we probably have here. But once she was able to alert the authorities, and because she had done such a brilliant job of memorizing key details about Evonitz and his apartment, they were able to very quickly figure out who he was. And so that's what led to this high-speed chase across multiple state lines. And it's what led to him committing suicide in Florida when it was very clear that he was about to be apprehended. Once he had killed himself, the authorities then had access to his DNA, to his fingerprints and things like that. And using that, they were able to confirm that he had killed both Katie and Kristen Lisk and Sophia Silva, 3 young women who were killed in the months right after Lollie and Julie in rural Virginia. And so we know those 3 for a fact. What we don't know is whether or not his DNA was ever loaded to CODIS. And so we don't know, and the FBI refuses to answer any of my Freedom of Information Act requests asking if his DNA has been loaded. They told me it's not in the best interest of the American public to know this.
No, of course not.
I don't understand how that's possible. But so we have those 3, but we also have, because we have his belongings, he had a chest that had dozens of women's underwear, ranging from what were probably fairly young teenagers to grown women, scrunchies. He had locks of hair that he had removed. And he kept this incredibly disturbing kind of logbook of women that he was actively pursuing, and in some cases stalking, using both online dating services, phones, things like that as well, too. We've been able to make contact with a few of them and confirm that they're alive. We haven't been able to make contact with all of them. We also know that he had a cousin that shared his name who lived in Chicago, and that he spent a lot of time there acting as the cousin. And one of the things that Deirdre and I are also starting to do is really tease through these records of women he was pursuing in Chicago and square that against women who either went missing or were murdered or have any kind of violent cases against them.
But the cousin for sure is not Evonitz. It's actually a separate person?
Correct.
Wow.
That's something I'd never heard before.
No, me either. Wow.
And his full name is Richard Marc Evonitz, is that right?
With a C. And I'm really interested, too, is he had a definite MO, and he would bind the women in a particular way. He would penetrate them, usually with foreign objects. And then there was a way that he would tend to leave them after they were killed. There's a very similar case here in Maine involving a young woman named Sarah Cherry that 100% fits this MO down to the stolen car, which was another thing that Evonitz used to do. And we know for an absolute fact that he happened to be stationed at the naval base and the ironworks, the shipyard here in Maine, literally 10 miles away from where this crime happened, right when it happened. There's a huge number of people here in the state of Maine who believe that he actually committed that as well, too. And there's currently an innocence movement. A man was convicted of the crime and is serving life in prison. And most people here have always assumed his innocence. And there's a growing movement right now to get some of the DNA that was taken from this particular crime scene and to see if you can get it tested against Evonitz.
Has there been any luck in obtaining his naval service records? I do find it interesting that he was in the Navy, as was Kathy, and we are a naval area right here. We have every type of military base around here, but we are primarily Navy. Any luck in getting those records?
I don't have his full records, but I do know that he spent most of his time here on the East Coast on the Kolsch, which was the ship that was used very oddly to collect the remains after the Challenger disaster, the Challenger explosion, the space shuttle.
Yeah.
And so that's probably, if listeners know that name, that's how. And so with some accuracy, we can say where the Kolsch was, and so where he was as well, too. But I don't personally have his naval records. I would love to get them, however, because I think that, again, knowing where he was, knowing his propensity for these types of crimes, I don't think we can say with any certainty, whatever, that it was only 3 victims.
Do we know how to spell Kolsch, the USS Kolsch, the ship itself?
You're going to have to check me on it, but I'm going to try to remember that it's Kolsch. I'm not exactly sure about that C, but that'll get folks close enough for sure.
We'll look that up. Yeah. Boy, it'd be interesting if any of our listeners know anyone that ever served aboard the USS Kolsch. We'd love to talk to you. And I know that many Navy ships, including the L.Y. Spear, the ship that my sister served aboard, there are groups that are kind of alumni groups of service personnel who had served on ships. If anyone knows anyone that has ever served aboard the Kolsch, we'd love to talk with you. The idea of getting Richard Marc Evonitz's service records is a really interesting one. And one other quick thing, in talking to my dad, who was also a naval officer, he had mentioned to me that when ships are in dry dock, as Evonitz's ship would have been up at the Bath Iron Works in beautiful Maine, there's a lot of downtime for the personnel that are aboard those ships. They're still assigned to the ship, but they're not out at sea. It's more of a 9 to 5 kind of job when you're in dry dock because you're literally not going anywhere. And so there's much more downtime for the men and women that serve aboard those ships because during those months, or it could even be a year or more, while the ships are being refitted or repaired, they end up, as my dad put it, they have a lot more time off and they have a lot more time to get into trouble. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
And we know that Evonitz's one of his favorite pastimes was driving around country roads. We know that was a real hobby of his. We know that he would regularly brag about stealing cars and how easy it was to hotwire cars. And again, we know his MO. And so when you take a look at this particular case, you consider the man, Dennis DeShane, who's currently serving life in prison, 0 criminal history, 0 criminal record whatsoever, 0 evidence of violence that anyone could find. And then you consider Marc Evonitz and you look at this particular case. Again, logically speaking, he makes an infinitely better suspect.
Wow, absolutely. I want to switch gears for 1 second away from Evonitz. And let's talk a little bit. You're a dedicated runner. You're a dedicated outdoors woman. How do you feel about the outdoors and your safety in it right about now? It's been about a year since this came out. Where are you with your relationship with the outdoors?
I still have not been able to solo camp in a tent. I think having seen the crime scene photos, and I know you two have had experience with this as well, having seen the crime scene photos and having them just really indelibly seared in my brain, it is very difficult for me to be in a tent and not feel panicked. My brain just draws this immediate connection. And so while I know that statistically speaking, backpacking and camping somewhere like Maine, I'm extremely safe, it's not a psychologically pleasant experience for me. So I haven't done that, but I do spend a lot of time in the wilderness. I'm an avid trail runner. I'm a hiker. And I like to joke right now that at this point, I'm so angry about all of this that God help the serial killer or serial rapist who attempts to approach me in the wilderness, because that person is probably going to be going to the police claiming that they were being harassed and threatened because I'm so, and I do not say that as a challenge, but I do say that I'm just in a place right now where when you think about the politics of the country, when you think about the ongoing misogyny in the country, and I say this as a woman, I say this as somebody who identifies as queer, I say this as a sexual assault survivor, I am so angry about what it is to be a woman in our culture right now. And so I think that kind of fuels me a little bit in the wilderness, but it's a place of real beauty and refuge. And I really believe in the value of forest bathing and immersing yourself in the wilderness as well, too. And I think everyone should get to have access to that.
Let me ask you a question that I don't think I've ever asked you before. If you were going to be through hiking the Appalachian Trail, and I know the usual route is to start in May in Georgia and then head north, ending in Maine, sometimes taking an entire summer to do that, which sounds like a wonderful experience, and I know people that have done it. If you were to do that today, would you carry a weapon?
That's a good question. Does bear spray count as a weapon?
I would say so.
Yeah, in my mind it would.
Point of view of the person or bear at the receiving end.
Yeah, I think I have very mixed thoughts on firearms in this country. As I detail in the book, I did go through multiple firearms courses and training, and I feel like that was really the right decision for me. I am not entirely comfortable with gun ownership as it's defined in this country right now. Bear spray seems like a really reasonable tool. The other thing that I've always thought about with guns too is I always joke, like, what are the logistics there? If my gun is in my backpack and I'm being apprehended, do I just say, hang on just 1 second, I just need to take this cap off and reach in here? Whereas a tiny little canister of bear spray that's dangling on your backpack, that seems like a reasonable thing to have for a variety of reasons. Including rabid animals. So that seems like a fair compromise to me.
Are there additional steps the National Park Service could take in making people safe in the backcountry, do you think?
Oh, how much time do we have? 7 episodes.
It's okay with us.
Unequivocally, yes, is the answer. One of the things that, first of all, that I outline in the book is that there is currently no codified mechanism for reporting violent crimes. So as citizens of this country and as park goers, we don't know how many crimes are occurring. We know the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, has done several studies and taken the Park Service and the Department of the Interior to task for their lack of reporting. It's up to whoever is the head ranger and whoever is the superintendent of a park whether or not these crimes ever get reported, and frankly, to what degree they ever get investigated. So first and foremost, we can start accurately accounting for that. And once we actually know how pervasive the problem is, then I think we can take more steps. The Park Service is woefully underfunded. There's a lot of attrition happening with rangers. Law enforcement rangers are not always adequately trained. They don't have adequate weapons or communication devices. In some cases, there's only one law enforcement ranger for an entire park that is going to span, in some cases, hundreds of square miles. So I think policing and making that presence known in a way that's obviously not intrusive and kind of stormtroopery for visitors, but making sure that folks know that you don't get a pass there is something else that's really important as well.
The Park Service has been criticized, though, for a culture of cover-up over the years. They've been likened to the Catholic Church, and I was an altar boy many years ago and raised Catholic. The Park Service has been criticized in writing, in magazine articles, in books, by people inside the organization and outside, that they cover up criminality among National Park Service employees, as well as downplay statistics involving crime, vandalism, potential violence within the National Park Service. How do you feel about that?
I think it's accurate. And Bill, I know you're familiar with this work, and I don't know if your listeners are. Paul Berkowitz has written 2 books really exploring this in depth, and I highly recommend them if this is an interesting subject. His book on the Indian trader, which is a story of what happened in the Grand Canyon, I think is particularly relevant and particularly telling. He's a former law enforcement ranger himself, and he talks about this notion that's called noble cause corruption, where sometimes rangers or any law enforcement officer will do the wrong thing legally or morally because they believe it's the right thing to, for instance, protect a fellow ranger or preserve the sense of calm and peacefulness within a park. He outlines in real detail some of how this happens. And this transfer system, which is very similar to this idea of the Catholic Church, especially what we saw in Boston during the sexual abuse cover-ups that were happening, is that parishes would transfer a priest rather than hold the priest accountable. And we've seen this in the Park Service as well, that rangers who have either been found negligent or have had disciplinary action taken against them, rather than having that get filed or sent up the personnel chain, they in fact have been transferred to other parks as well. And what I think is really most disturbing about that is we don't really have a sense of how often that happens, but we know that it's enough that it's a significant problem.
All right, I want to make our listeners jealous for a second and tell them about the fact that I did get to meet you in person. Was it only a week ago?
Wow.
Or was it 2 weeks ago?
10 days ago.
Okay, all right. Yeah, whatever it was a wonderful experience to get to hang out with you. So tell us a little bit about your speaking engagement at the Library of Virginia and what all that entailed.
Yeah, I was really delighted to be asked by them to come speak, especially because Richmond is obviously so close to where these crimes occurred. And I know how deeply personal it is for so many of the people there. So in addition to get to have some time with the great Kristen Dilley, I was really thrilled to be able to talk to the audience as well, too. And I was really profoundly moved by the number of people who waited online after to chat and to tell me their stories. And it was people who used to go to the park and don't go to the park anymore. It was a woman whose husband had been an initial suspect and the family had really been torn apart by that.
Oh.
It was a lot of people who had a very personal connection to these stories. And for me as a journalist, it's incredibly poignant to hear those stories and to remind myself not only how deeply personal it is for the immediate friends and family of victims, but the way in which these kinds of acts of violence really do start to serve as hate crimes in the sense that they take entire demographics and radically change their relationship to play. And for so many of the people that I met at this library event, this event radically altered and negatively altered their relationship, not only with Shenandoah, but with the wilderness writ large.
In the book Trailed, you talk about this quite a bit, how meaningful the outdoors have been for you as a woman and as an outdoors woman, and for so many other people that you've befriended. Yet here we are again. You're speaking about the book. The book's been out for a year. It's had a tremendous impact, but you're hearing from people who are talking about the ripple effect of this 1996 double homicide.
Yeah, when I was working on the book, I interviewed Claudia Brunner. She and her partner, Rebecca White, were both shot just off the Appalachian Trail. Rebecca was killed. Claudia had multiple bullets in her and somehow managed to hike miles out and get help. And she wrote about that very poignantly in a book called 8 Bullets. And she talked not only about what it was to be the victim of what was a very intentional hate crime, but then also what it was to be investigated by law enforcement officers who had next to no experience dealing with someone who had been in a same-sex relationship, and just how re-traumatizing that plus the court was. And we had talked about this notion of hate crime and what is a hate crime, because Lollie and Julie's legal case very famously became the first official federal hate crime case in the United States. So there's a lot of really significant historical resonance there. People are very divided about whether or not this was a hate crime in terms of the perpetrator's motivations, whether the perpetrator was aware of Lollie and Julie's sexuality. But what Claudia Brenner said to me, and I've always just really taken this to heart, is she said, for me and for my entire community of lesbian women, we no longer feel safe in the wilderness. And in that regard, for every woman, for every LGBT person who has severed their relationship with the wilderness because of this violence, this is absolutely a hate crime. And that's a really important distinction to me. We can talk about hate crimes in terms of the perpetrator and the motivation, but I think understanding the deep impact of a crime is just as useful in terms of identifying it as a potential hate crime.
There's a flip-flop there, I think, that has happened where people that would identify with the LGBTQ community would probably say that they feel safer in America's big cities than they would somewhere out in a beautiful spot in the middle of the woods or mountains. I think people think, oh, you're much more at risk if you're in a big city. And yet I think, a lot of members of this community, they feel safer there in the big town than they ever would in the woods, probably because of the number of incidents like this, of harassment, assault, and you can just keep escalating, rape, murder. Even though hate crime is not an expression used commonly till about 1996, the phenomenon and this sad series of incidents has been going on for decades.
Yeah, and we can fold in all sorts of what we call socially subordinate groups in that as well, too. The number of Black people and BIPOC people who don't feel safe in the wilderness, not only because of current events, but also this kind of epigenetic generational memory of centuries of really terrible things that have happened to people of color in the wilderness as well, too. And so one of the things I definitely wanted to try to highlight in the book is this question of who gets to feel safe in our parks and our forests and our deserts and our wilderness places, who gets to feel safe and why. And I think as a country and as a culture, we still have so much work to do on that front. It's really a position of privilege to go for a hike in the woods and feel safe and not be looking over your shoulder. And I think we haven't really talked about that as a country.
Kate, I'm scanning right now your archives on Outside Magazine, and you've done a lot of work, wonderful work for Outside. Before there was Trailed, it looks like there was a lot of different articles about murder and violence on the AT. Can you highlight for our listeners some of the additional reporting that you've done for Outside and where they can find it?
Sure. One of the most heartbreaking cases actually occurred while I was writing one of the penultimate drafts of Trailed, and that was the murder of Ron Sanchez, who had been hiking. He was a veteran of the Middle Eastern conflict, and he had come back and was experiencing PTSD and really found a sense of renewal in hiking, which I think so many of us have. He was attempting a through hike on the trail when a young man who had some profound mental illness and long history of violence assaulted not only Ron Sanchez, but 3 other hikers who happened to be camping for the night as well. And Ron really, I think, valiantly tried to save the other 3 hikers and lost his life as a result. So that was a case that really resonated with me and just made it really real how this continues to be a problem on the trail. And there are others as well, too. Thankfully, not a lot. And I think that's a really important point to make. But addressing these and thinking about these, I think, is really important. And luckily, when I served as trail correspondent for Outside Magazine, I had broad leeway in terms of what I was covering. So I could tell those stories, which are, again, really upsetting. I told stories about the history of segregation at Shenandoah. But then there were also fun stories, too, like folks who were setting fastest known time attempts on the trails and some of the silliness of the Appalachian Trail culture as well, too. It was really a very sort of immersive experience for me to do that work, and I really loved it.
Yeah, just from a total fangirl perspective here, I saw you wrote 2 pieces about Scott Jurek. Did you get to meet him?
I did.
Oh my God. That's so cool.
You have to explain who Scott is.
He and Carl Meltzer both had, and I don't think they'll mind me saying that, they both had a very show up and blow up fastest known time attempt. I really love the little guys who aren't sponsored and don't have all of the kind of bells and whistles and fandom following them, who have gone on to do it very quietly in the old fashioned way. I'm a traditionalist where that's concerned, so I'm always cheering for those guys.
And because I know you don't know Bill, Scott Jurek he's an ultra runner, and he made an FKT fastest known time attempt to run the AT. It's insane. He wrote an amazing book about it, and I'm in love with his book. It's amazing. So I'm very jealous you got to meet Scott Jurek, Kate. That's so cool.
Help out the
if
civilians.
I can recommend Jen Farr Davis, who held the record for quite some time, regardless of gender. She has a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Pursuit of Endurance, where she tells not only her own story, but she talks to a lot of these fastest known time record holders and these very long distance hikers and runners to look at what is it that motivates us to do this? Why are we so compelled by it? And I just think it's a wonderful book.
All right, I wrote it down. Yeah, and you do ultras as well. You were recovering from one still when we talked. For anybody who doesn't know, can you tell what an ultra marathon is and why do you do them?
Yeah, the first part of that is easier to answer than the second. So an ultra technically is any race that's longer than 26.2 miles. In trail running, one of the most common distances is 50 kilometers, and then 50 miles, 100 kilometers, and 100 miles. And I have a dear friend and running partner who talks about how you do this, and she calls it burrito pace. And so basically, if you can't eat a bean and cheese burrito at the pace that you're running, you're doing it too fast. So that's a huge part of why that's my... Kristen, I know you run 5Ks. I would rather run 50 miles than a 5K. I feel like 5Ks are the most painful thing ever, whereas just loafing along in the woods for a day feels a lot more manageable to me too. So I think it's people like you who are doing the crazy hardcore work.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
All I can say is color me intimidated with these two amazing women. Can I just stay home and man the phones and maybe have a burrito and root you on?
We're so thrilled that you were able to spend some time talking with us today. If people want to find your book, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't, where can they go to find your book? Where is it available?
I always love it when people patronize their local independent bookstores. So that's always my very favorite go-to. If they don't have it, they can certainly order it. Obviously, Amazon is another option as well, too. And we're just really glad for anybody who takes the time.
And our natural question, what's next for Kathryn Kate Miles?
We finally put together the full package for the streaming series version of the book. We've just signed on a really wonderful director. I don't know if I'm actually allowed to say her name yet, but she's exactly perfect for this. And so right now, as we speak, we're starting to take this out to market. And that's a really exciting prospect for me, largely because I think it's an entirely different population to reach by way of this story. And I also feel like it's a really great opportunity to continue the investigation and to talk in more detail about everything that's happened since the book was published.
They called me a week or two ago and said, would I be willing to appear on camera and talk about you in the book? And I said, I'd think about it.
Ha! I know better than that, and I'm already grateful. The number of favors I need to repay to Bill Thomas are currently it's a list that I feel I'm never going to be able to get through.
And I was thrilled, actually, that after this Mutual Admiration Society, I was thrilled that you and Kristen were actually able to be in the same room. And she just came home buzzed from your incredible talk at the Library of Virginia.
Again, talk about mutual admiration societies. I think the work that you do is so great. And to finally get to sit and chat with you was just such a gift for me too, and was absolutely worth the trip. So thank you.
Good call on the two of you having an early dinner beforehand, because it sounded like everybody wanted to talk to you, Kate, after your talk.
And afterwards, I stumbled back to my hotel room, and I think I was in bed 5 minutes later. So I would not have been much of a dinner date after all of that.
The book is Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders, and we can definitely hope for that eventual ending. Kate, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Mind Over Murder.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's going to do it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristen Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.